Hi guys, before we start chapter number 6, let's recall what we learned in chapter number 5, that is rulers and buildings. So the Qutub Minar was built by Qutbuddin Aibak in 1199, and the minar has the surface of the minar is curved and angular. And remember that very few buildings were made of stone or brick 800 years ago. Between the 8th and the 18th centuries, kings and their officers built two kinds of structures. The first were forts, palaces, garden residences, and tombs, safe, protected, and grandiose places of rest in this world and the next. That is number two, would be the second were structures made for public activity, including temples, mosques, tanks, wells, carav- caravanserais, and bazaars. Kings were expected to care for their subjects, and by making structures for their use and comfort, rulers hoped to win their praise. Monuments provide an insight into the technologies used for construction. The task becomes difficult if we want to use a large room with an elaborate superstructure. This requires more sophisticated skills. So, what is a superstructure? A part of a building above the ground floor. Roofs, doors, and windows were still made by placing a horizontal beam across two vertical columns, a style of architecture called trebet or corbelled. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, the trebet style was used in the construction of temples, mosques, tombs, and in buildings attached to large stepped wells, baulis. So figure number 2a, screen in the Quwat al-Islam Mosque, Delhi. Number 2b, corbelled technique used in the construction of the screen. So these are two temples differently constructed. The first one is Kandariya Mahadeva temple indicated the Kandariya Mahadeva temple dedicated to Shiva was constructed in 999 by the king Dandadeva of the Chandela dynasty. Figure 3b is the plan of the temple. An ornamented gateway led to the entrance and the main hall Mahamandapa where dances were performed. The image of the chief deity was placed in the main shrine, that is Garbhagriha. This was the place of ritual worship where only the king, his immediate families, and priests gathered. The Khajuraho complex contained royal temples where commoners were not allowed entry. The temples were decorated with elaborately carved sculptures. Figure number 4. The Raja Rajeshwara temple at Thanjavur had the tallest shikhara amongst temples of its time. Constructing it was not easy because there were no cranes in those days and the 90-ton stone for the top of the shikhara was too heavy to lift manually. Two technological and stylistic developments are noticeable from the 12th century. Number one is that the weight of the superstructure above the doors and windows was sometimes carried by arches. This architectural form was called arcuate. So figure number 5a, a true arc. The keystone at the center of the arc transferred the weight of the superstructure to the base of the arc. Number 2 would be limestone cement was increasingly used in construction. This was very high quality cement which when mixed with stone chips hardened into concrete. This made construction of large structures easier and faster. So, true arch, figure number B, true arch. True arc detail from the Alai Darwaza. Temples and mosques were beautifully constructed because they were places of worship. They were also meant to demonstrate the power, wealth, and devotion of the patrons. And inscription mentions that it was built by King Raja Rajadeva. So Raja Rajeshwara temple was built by King Raja Rajadeva for the worship of his god Raja Rajeshwaram. Notice how the names of the ruler and the god are very similar. The king took the god's name because it was auspicious and he wanted to appear like a god. Through the rituals of worship in the temple, one god, Raja Rajadeva, honored another, Raja Rajeshwaram. The largest temple were all constructed by kings. Muslim sultans and padshahs did not claim to be incarnations of God, but Persian court chronicles describe the sultan as the shadow of God. And inscription in the Kawat al-Islam mosque explained that God chose Alauddin as a king because he had the qualities of Moses and Solomon, the great lawgivers of the past. The greatest lawgiver and architect was God himself. He created the world out of chaos and introduced order and symmetry. The earliest new dynasty, as each new dynasty came to power, kings wanted to emphasize their moral right to be rulers. Constructing places of worship provided rulers with a chance to proclaim their close relationship with God. It was widely believed that the rule of a just king would be an age of plenty when the heavens would not withhold rain. At the same time, making precious water available by constructing tanks and reservoirs was highly praised. Sultan Iltutmish won universal respect for constructing a large reservoir just outside Delhi-e-Guana. It was called the House-e-Sultani or the King's Reservoir. Rulers often constructed tanks and reservoirs, big and small, for use by ordinary people. Why were temples destroyed? It was because kings built temples to demonstrate their devotion to God and their power and wealth. So, it is not surprising that when they attacked one another's kingdoms, they often targeted their buildings. In the early 9th century, when the Pandyan king Srimara Srivalabha invaded Sri Lanka and defeated the king Sena I 831 to 851, the Buddhist monk and chronicler Dhammakirti noted, he removed all the valuables, the statue of the Buddha made entirely of gold in the jeweled palace, and the golden images in the various monasteries. All these he seized. The blow to the pride of the Sinhalese ruler had to be avenged, and the next Sinhalese ruler, Sena II, ordered his general to invade Madurai, the capital of the Pandyas. The Buddhist chronicler noted that the expedition made a special effort to find and restore the gold statue of the Buddha. Similarly, in the early 11th century, when the Chola king Rajendra I built a Shiva temple in his capital, he filled it with prized statues seized from defeated rulers. An incomplete list included a sun pedestal from the Chalukyas, a Ganesha statue, and several statues of Durga, a Nandi statue from the eastern Chalukyas, and image of Bhairava, a form of Shiva, and Bhairavi from the Kalingas of Orissa, and a Kali statue from the Palace of Bengal. Sultan Muhammad of Ghazni was a contemporary of Rajendra I. During his campaigns in the subcontinent, he also attacked the temples of defeated kings and looted their wealth and idols. Sultan Mahmud was not a very important ruler at that time, but by destroying temples, especially the one at Somnath, he tried to win credit as a great hero of Islam. In the political culture of the Middle Ages, most rulers displayed their political might and military success by attacking and looting the places of worship of defeated rulers. Under the Mughals, architecture became more complex. Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, and especially Shah Jahan were personally interested in literature, art, and architecture. In his autobiography, Babur described his interest in planning and laying out formal gardens placed within rectangular walled enclosures and divided into four quarters by artificial channels. These gardens were called Char Bagh, four gardens, because of their symmetrical division into quarters. Beginning with Akbar, some of the most beautiful char baghs were constructed by Jahangir and Shah Jahan in Kashmir, Agra, and Delhi. For inspiration, Akbar's architects turned to the tombs of the Central Asian ancestor Timur. The central towering dome and the tall gateway, Pishtak, became important aspects of Mughal architecture, first visible in Humayun's tomb. The tomb was placed in the center of a huge formal char bagh and built in the tradition known as Eight Paradises or Hast Behist, a central hall surrounded by 8 rooms. The building was constructed with red sandstone edged with white marble. It was during Shah Jahan's reign that the different elements of Mughal architecture was fused together in a grand harmonious synthesis. His reign witnessed a huge amount of construction activity, especially in Agra and Delhi. The ceremonial halls of public and private audience, Diwan-e-Khas or Aam, were carefully planned. Placed within a large courtyard, these courts were also described as Jehil, Sutun, or 40-pillared halls. Shah Jahan's audience halls were specially constructed to resemble a mosque. The pedestal on which his throne was placed was frequently described as the Qibla, the direction faced by Muslims at prayer, since everybody faced that direction when court was in session. The idea of the king as a representative of God on earth was suggested by these architectural features. The connection between royal justice and the imperial court was emphasized by Shah Jahan in his newly constructed court in the Red Fort at Delhi. Behind the emperor's throne was a series of Petra Dura. They are colored hard stones placed in depressions carved into marble or sandstone, creating beautiful ornate patterns. So Petra Dura inlays that depicted the legendary Greek god Orpheus playing the lute. It was believed that Orpheus' music could calm ferocious beasts until they coexisted together peaceably. The construction of Shah Jahan's audience hall aimed to communicate that the king's justice would treat the high and the low as equals, creating a world where all could live together in harmony. In the early years of his reign, Shah Jahan's capital was at Agra, a city where the nobility had constructed their homes on the banks of the river Yamuna. These were set in the midst of formal gardens constructed in the Charbagh format. The Charbagh garden also had a variation that historians describe as the riverfront garden. In this, the dwelling was not located in the middle of the Chahar in the middle of the Char Bagh, but at its edge, close to the bank of the river. Shah Jahan adapted the riverfront garden in the layout of the Taj Mahal, the grandest architectural accomplishment of his reign. Here, the white marble mausoleum was placed on a terrace by the edge of the river, and the garden was to its south. Shah Jahan developed this architectural form as a means to control the access that nobles had to the river. In the new city of Shahjahanabad that he constructed in Delhi, the imperial palace commanded the riverfront. Only specially favored nobles like his eldest son Dara Sukho were given access to the river. All others had to construct their homes in the city away from the river Yamuna. Region and Empire. As construction activity increased between the 8th and 18th centuries, there was also a considerable sharing of ideas across regions. The traditions of one region were adopted by another. In Vijayanagara, for example, the elephant stables of the rulers were strongly influenced by the style of architecture found in the adjoining sultanates of Vijapur and Golconda. In Vrindavan, near Mathura, temples were constructed in architectural styles that were very similar to the Mughal palaces in Fatehpur Sikri. Mughal rulers were particularly skilled in adapting regional architectural styles in the construction of their own buildings. In Bengal, for example, the local rulers had developed a roof that was designed to resemble a thatched hut. The Mughals liked this Bangla dome, uh, and so and so much that they used it in their architecture. The impact of other regions were also evident. In Akbar's capital at Fatehpur Sikri, many of the buildings show the influence of the architectural styles of Gujarat and Malwa. So some architectural styles known as Gothic was distinguished by high pointed arches, the use of stained glass, often painted with scenes drawn from the Bible, and flying buttresses. So one example would be Notre Dame in Paris. So that's all. Let's start chapter number 6. Now let's start chapter number 6, Towns, Traders and Craftspersons. What would a traveler visiting a medieval town expect to find? This would depend on what kind of a town it was: a temple town, an administrative center, a commercial town, or a port town, to name just some possibilities. In fact, many towns combined several functions. They were administrative centers, temple towns, as well as centers of commercial activities and crafts production. So let's see map 1. Some important centers of trade and artisanal production in Central and South India. Administrative centers. You read about the Chola dynasty in chapter 2. Let's travel in our imagination to Thanjavur, the capital of the Cholas. So, Thanjavur is the capital of the Cholas as it was 1,000 years ago. The perennial river Kaveri flows near this beautiful town. One hears the bells of the Raja Rajeshwara temple built by King Raja Chola. The townspeople are all praised for its architect Kunjara Malan Raja Perunthajan, who has proudly carved his name on the temple wall. Inside is a massive shivling. So the name of the architect is Kunja Ramalan Raja Perunthajan. Besides the temple, there are palaces with mandapas or pavilions. Kings hold court in these mandapas, issuing orders to their subordinates. There are also barracks for the army. The town is bustling with markets selling grain, spices, cloth, and jewelry. Water supply for the town comes from wells and tanks. The Salia weavers of Thanjavur and the nearby town of Urayur are busy producing cloth for flags to be used in the temple festival, fine cottons for the king and nobility, and coarse cotton for the masses. Some distance away at Swamimalai, the sthapatis or sculptors are making exquisite bronze idols and tall ornamental bell metal lamps. Temple towns and pilgrimage centers. Thanjavur is also an example of a temple town. Temple towns represent a very important pattern of urbanization, the process by which cities develop. Temples were often central to the economy and society. Rulers built temples to demonstrate their devotion to various deities. They also endowed temples with grants of land and money to carry out elaborate rituals, feed pilgrims and priests, and celebrate festivals. Pilgrims who flocked to the temples also made donations. Bronze, bell metal, and the lost wax technique. Bronze is an alloy containing copper and tin. Bell metal contains greater proportion of tin than other kinds of bronze. This produces a bell-like sound. Chola bronze statues, see chapter 2, were made using the lost wax technique. First, an image was made of wax. So first we are going to make an image by wax. This was covered with clay and allowed to dry. Next it was heated and a tiny hole was made in the clay cover. The molten wax was drained out through this hole. Then molten metal was poured into the clay mold through the hole. Once the metal cooled and solidified. The clay cover was carefully removed and the image was cleaned and polished. Okay, so what is this lost wax technique? First, an image was made of wax. This was covered with clay and allowed to dry. Next, it was heated and a tiny hole was made in the clay cover. The molten wax was drained out through this hole. Then, molten metal was poured into the clay mold through the hole. Once the metal cooled and solidified, the clay cover was carefully removed and the image was cleaned and polished. What do you think were the advantages of using this technique? This figure number 1 is a bronze statue of Krishna subduing the serpent demon Kalia. This is the serpent demon Kalia. Temple authorities used their wealth to finance trade and banking. Gradually, a large number of priests, workers, artisans, traders, etc., settled near the temple to cater to its needs and those of the pilgrims. Thus grew temple towns. Towns emerged around temples, such as those of Vilashvamin, Vilsa or Vidisha in Madhya Pradesh, and Somnath in Gujarat. Some important temple towns included Kanchipuram and Madurai in Tamil Nadu and Tirupati in Andhra Pradesh. Pilgrimage centers also slowly developed into townships. Vrindavan, Uttar Pradesh, and Tiruvannamalai, Tamil Nadu are examples of two such towns. Ajmer, Rajasthan, was the capital of the Chauhan kings in the 12th century and later became the Suba headquarters under the Mughals. It provides an excellent example of religious coexistence. Khwaja Muinuddin Chisti. The celebrated Sufi saint. See also chapter 8, who settled there in the 12th century, attracted devotees from all creeds. Near Ajmer is a lake, Pushkar, which has attracted pilgrims from ancient times. Make a list of towns in your district and try to classify these as administrative centers or as temple or pilgrim centers. A network of small towns. From the 8th century onwards, the subcontinent was dotted with several small towns. These probably emerged from large villages. They usually had a mandapika or mandi of later times to which nearby villagers brought their produce to sale. They also had market streets called hut of later times, lined with shops. Besides, there were streets for different kinds of artisans such as potters, oil pressers, sugar makers, toddy makers, smiths, stone masons, etc. While some traders lived in the town, others traveled from town to town. Many came from far and near to these towns to buy local articles and sell products of distant places like horses, salt, camphor, saffron, betel leaf, and spices like pepper. So this picture is a city market. Usually a Samanta, in later times a Jamindar, built a fortified palace in or near these towns. They levied taxes on traders, artisans, and articles of trade, and sometimes donated the right to collect these taxes to local temples which had been built by themselves or by rich merchants. These rights were recorded in inscriptions that have survived to this day. So, this picture is a wood carver. Taxes on markets. The following is a summary from a 10th century inscription from Rajasthan which lists the dues that were to be collected by temple authorities. There were taxes in kind on sugar and jaggery, dyes, thread and cotton, on coconuts, salt, areca nuts, butter, sesame oil, on cloth. Besides, there were taxes on traders, on those who sold metal goods, on distillers, on oil, on cattle fodder, and on loads of grain. Some of these taxes were collected in kind, while others were collected in cash. Find out more about present day taxes on markets. Who collects these? How are they collected? And what are they used for? Now let's see traders, big and small. There were many kinds of traders. This included the Banjaras. See also chapter 7. Several traders, especially horse traders, formed associations with headmen who negotiated in their behalf with warriors too who bought horses. Since traders had to pass through many kingdoms and forests, they usually traveled in caravans and formed guilds to protect their interest. There were several such guilds in South India from the 8th century onwards. The most famous were the Manigramam, and Nanadesi. These guilds traded extensively both within the peninsula and with Southeast Asia and China. There were also communities like the Chetiars and the Marwari Oswal who went on to become the principal trading groups of the community. Gujarati traders, including the communities of Hindu Banyas and Muslim Bohras, traded extensively with the ports of the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and China. They sold textiles and spices in these ports and in exchange brought gold and ivory from Africa, spices, tin, Chinese, blue pottery, and silver from Southeast Asia and China. As you can see, during this period, there was a great circulation of people and goods. What impact do you think this would have had on the lives of people in towns and cities? Make a list of artisans living in towns. The towns of the west coast were home to Arab, Persian, Chinese, Jewish, and Syrian Christian traders. Indian spices and cloth sold in the Red Sea ports were purchased by Italian traders and eventually reached European markets, fetching very high profits. Spices grown in tropical climates, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, dried ginger, etc., became an important part of European cooking, and cotton cloth was very attractive. This eventually drew European traders to India. We will shortly read about how this changed the face of trading and towns. Kabul. With its rugged, mountainous landscape, Kabul in present day Afghanistan became politically and commercially important from the 16th century onwards. Kabul and Kandahar were linked to the celebrated Silk Route. Besides, trade in horses was primarily carried on through this route. In the 17th century, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, a diamond merchant, estimated that the horse trade at Kabul amounted to 30,000 annually, which was a huge sum in those days. Camels carried dried fruits, dates, carpets, silks, and even fresh fruits from Kabul to the subcontinent and elsewhere. Slaves were also brought here for sale. Crafts in towns. The craftspersons of Bidar were so famed for their inlay work in copper and silver, that it came to be called Bidri. The Panchalas or Vishwakarma community, consisting of goldsmiths, bronzesmiths, blacksmiths, masons, and carpenters, were essential to the building of temples. They also played an important role in the construction of palaces, big buildings, tanks, and reservoirs. Similarly, weavers such as the Saliar or Kekolars Similarly, weavers such as the Saliar or Kaikolars emerged as prosperous communities, making donations to temples. Some aspects of cloth making, like cotton cleaning, spinning, and dyeing, became specialized and independent crafts. So, this figure number 5 is a 17th century candle stand, brass with black overlay. And figure number 4 is a shawl border. The changing fortunes of towns. Some towns like Ahmedabad in Gujarat went on to become major commercial cities, but others like Thanjavur shrank in size and importance over the centuries. Murshidabad in West Bengal on the banks of the Bhagirathi, which rose to prominence as a center for silk and became the capital of Bengal in 1704, declined in the course of the century as the weavers faced competition from cheap mill made cloth from England. Okay. So they declined in the course of the history as the weavers faced competition from the cheap mill-made cloth from England. Okay, a closer look. Hampi, Masulipatam and Surat. So figure number 6. This is view of the watchtower through a broken wall of the enclosure of Hampi. So the architectural splendor of Hampi. Hampi is located in the Krishna Tungabhadra basin, which formed the nucleus of the Vijayanagara Empire, founded in 1336. The magnificent ruins at Hampi reveal a well-fortified city. No mortar or cementing agent was used in the construction of these walls, and the technique followed was to wedge them together by interlocking. A fortified city. This is how a Portuguese traveler, Domingo Paes, described Hampi in the 16th century. I at the entrance, okay, at the entrance of the gate where those pass who come from Goa. This king has made within it a very strong city fortified with walls and towers. These walls are not like those of other cities, but are made of very strong masonry, such as would be found in few other parts, and inside very beautiful rows of buildings made after their manner with flat roofs. Why do you think the city was fortified? Figure number 7. This is stone chariot, Vittala temple. The architecture of Hampi was distinctive. The buildings in the royal complex had splendid arches, domes, and pillared halls with niche for holding sculptures. They also had well-planned orchards and pleasure gardens with sculptural motifs such as the lotus and corbels. In its heyday in the 15th, 16th centuries, Hampi bustled with commercial and cultural activities. Moors, a name used collectively for Muslim merchants. Khetis and agents of European, or we can say Chetris, and agents of European traders such as the Portuguese thronged the markets of Hampi. So the architecture of Hampi was distinctive. The buildings in the royal complex had splendid arches, domes, and pillared halls with niches for holding sculptures. They also had well-planned orchards and pleasure gardens with sculptural motifs such as the lotus and corbels. In its heyday in the 15th, 16th centuries, Hampi bustled with commercial and cultural activities. Moors, a name used collectively for Muslim merchants, Chetris, and agents of European traders such as the Portuguese thronged the markets of Hampi. Temples were the hub of cultural activities, and Devadasis, temple dancers, performed before the deity, loyalty, and masses in the many pillared halls in the Virupaksha, a form of Shiva temple. The Mahanavami festival, known today as Navratri in the south, was one of the most important festivals celebrated at Hampi. Archaeologists have found the Mahanavami festival, known today as Navratri in the south, was one of the most important festivals celebrated at Hampi. The archaeologists have found that Mahanavami platform where the king received guests and accepted tribute from subordinate chiefs. From here he also watched dance and music performances as well as wrestling bouts. Hampi fell into ruin following the defeat of Vijayanagara in 1565 by the Deccani Sultans, the rulers of Golconda, Bijapur, Ahmednagar, Berar, and Bidar. A gateway to the west, Surat. Surat in Gujarat was the emporium. Emporium is a place where goods from diverse production centers are bought and sold. So, uh, Surat in Gujarat was the emporium of Western trade during the Mughal period, along with Cambay, present day Khambhat, and somewhat later Ahmedabad. Surat was the gateway for trade with West Asia via the Gulf of Hormuz. Surat has also been called the gate to Mecca because many pilgrim ships set sail from here. The city was cosmopolitan and people of all caste, creed lived there. In the 17th century, the Portuguese, Dutch, and English had their factories and warehouses at Surat. According to the English chronicler Ovington, who wrote an account of the port in 1689, on average 100 ships of different countries could be found anchored at a port at any given time. There were also several retail and wholesale shops selling cotton textiles. The textiles of Surat were famous for their gold lace borders, zari, and had a market in West Asia, Africa, and Europe. The state built numerous rest houses to take care of the needs of people from all over the world who came to the city. There were magnificent buildings and innumerable pleasure parks. The Kathiawad Seths or Mahajans, money changers, had huge banking houses at Surat. It is worthy that the Surat Handis were honored in the far-off markets of Cairo in Egypt, Basra in Iraq, and Antwerp in Belgium. Hundi is a note recording a deposit made by a person. The amount deposited can be claimed in another place by presenting the record of the deposit. However, Surat began to decline towards the end of the 17th century. This was because of many factors: the loss of markets and productivity because of the decline of the Mughal Empire, control of the sea routes by the Portuguese, and competition from Bombay, present-day Mumbai, where the English East India Company shifted its headquarters in 1668. Today, Surat is a bustling commercial center. Fishing in troubled waters, Masulipattnam. The town of Masulipattnam or Machlipattnam, literally fish port town, lay on the delta of the Krishna River. In the 17th century, it was a center of intense activity. Both the Dutch and English East India Company attempted to control Masulipattnam as it became the most important port on the Andhra coast. The fort at Masulipattnam was built by the Dutch. A poor fisher town. This is description of Masulipattnam by William Matwold, a factor of the English East India Company in 1620. Factor is an official merchant of the East India Company. This is the chief port of Golconda, where the right worshipful East India Company have their agent. It is a small town but populous, unwalled, ill built, and worse situated. Within all the springs are brackish. It was first a poor fisher town. I afterwards, okay, afterwards, the convenience of the road, a place where ships can't anchor, made it a residence for merchants, and so continues since our and the Dutch nation frequented this coast. Why did the English and the Dutch decide to establish settlements in Masulipatam? The Qutub Shahi rulers of Golconda imposed royal monopolies on the sale of textiles, spices, and other items to prevent the trade passing completely into the hands of the various East India companies. Fierce competition among various trading groups. The Golconda nobles, Persian merchants, Telugu Komati, Chettis, and European traders made the city populous and prosperous. As the Mughals began to extend their power to Golconda, their representative, the governor Mir Jumla, who was also a merchant, began to play off the Dutch and the English against each other. In 1686 to 1687, Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb annexed Golconda. This caused the European companies to look for alternatives. It was a part of the new policy of the East India Company that it was not enough if a port had connections with the production centers of the hinterland. The new company trade centers, it was felt, should combine political, administrative, and commercial roles. As the company traders moved to Bombay, Calcutta, present-day Kolkata, and Madras, present-day Chennai, Masulipatam lost both its merchants and prosperity and declined in the course of the 18th century, being today nothing more than a dilapidated little town. New towns and traders. New towns and traders. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European countries were searching for spices and textiles, which had become popular both in Europe and West Asia. The English, Dutch, and French formed East India companies in order to expand their commercial activities in the East. Initially, great Indian traders like Mullah Abdul Ghaffar and Virji Vora, who owned a large number of ships, competed with them. However, the European companies used their naval power to gain control of the sea trade and forced Indian traders to work in their to work as their agents. Ultimately, the English emerged as the most successful commercial and political power in the subcontinent. The spurt in demand for goods like textiles led to a great expansion of the crafts of spinning, weaving, bleaching, dyeing, etc., with more and more people taking them up. Indian textile designs became increasingly refined. However, this period also saw the decline of the independence of craftspersons. They now began to work on a system of advances which meant that they had to weave cloth which was already promised to European agents. Weavers no longer had the liberty to sell their own cloth or weaving their own patterns. They had to reproduce the designs supplied to them by the company agents. The 18th century saw the rise of Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, which are nodal cities today. Crafts and commerce underwent major changes as merchants and artisans, such as weavers, were moved into the black towns established by the European companies within these new cities. The blacks, or native traders and craftspersons, were were confined here, while the white rulers occupied the superior residences of Fort St. George in Madras or Fort St. William in Calcutta. The story of crafts and commerce in the 18th century will be taken up next year. So this figure number 8 is a Bombay street, early 19th. Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. In the 15th century, European sailors undertook unprecedented explorations of sea routes. They were driven by the desire to find ways of reaching the Indian subcontinent and obtaining spices. Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese sailor, was one of those who sailed through the Atlantic to the African coast, went round it, crossing over to the Indian Ocean. His first journey took more than a year. He reached Calicut in 1498 and returned to Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, the following year. He lost 2 of his 4 ships, and of the 170 men at the start of the journey, only 54 survived. In spite of the obvious hazards, the routes that were opened up proved to be extremely profitable, and he was followed by English, Dutch, and French sailors. The search for sea routes to India had another unexpected fallout. On the assumption that the earth was round, Christopher Columbus, an Italian, decided to sail westwards across the Atlantic Ocean to find a route to India. He landed in the West Indies. Which got their name because of this confusion in 1492. He was followed by sailors and conquerors from Spain and Portugal, who occupied large parts of Central and South America, often destroying earlier settlements in the area. So this figure number 9 is Vasco da Gama. Now let's do fill in the blanks. Number A. The Raja Rajeshwara temple was built in 110 AD. Ajmer is associated with the Sufi saint Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti. Hampi was the capital of the Vijayanagara Empire. Number D. The Dutch established a settlement at Masulipatam in Andhra Pradesh. Now let's try true or false. Number A. We know the name of the architect of the Raja Rajeshwara temple from an inscription. That's true. Number B. Merchants preferred to travel individually rather than in caravans. It's false. They want to travel in caravans. Kabul was a major center for trade in elephants, nope, in horses. Number D. Surat was an important trading port on the Bay of Bengal. It's false. It's in the Arabian Sea. That's all guys. Thank you. See you in my next video. Bye.